Paul, Basil, and Wilfred Njagi, welcome to this season of Investments for Impact. This is a very exciting season. I think it's going to be our best season so far. Why? Because we're going back to the very beginning. And this particular episode actually is the start of that season. So it's going to be an awesome conversation. To kick us off, I would like us to begin with introductions. Now, we'll start with you, Paul. You, in my books, are a living legend. You conceptualized Villgro, executed it, and scaled it globally. So I'd like to give you a little time to just take liberty and introduce yourself in whatever way you would like to.
Sure, thank you. It feels nice to be called a living legend, but with that introductory question, let me start by saying um, I always had impact as my central theme. I really wanted to make change in the lives of people, especially those who were underserved, disadvantaged, poor, economically backwards, and so on and so forth. So um, that led me to study um, about agribusinesses, social issues, environmental issues, and so on and so forth. So I did a program. By the way, a step back. Let me take a step back. I studied engineering, and that led me to machines. And I wasn't really excited about machines, but I liked how machines benefited people. So technology creating impact on the lives of people really inspired me. I then went on to study a course in forestry management, and which actually taught me a whole lot of agribusinesses, cooperatives, and all of that. And then 6 7 years I worked with one of India's leading dairy cooperatives, and that was when after 6 7 years of work, I founded Villgro, India's, I would say, at that point, maybe first one of the first impact incubators in India. So I did that 20 years, and bulk of my career is really will grow as an impact incubator. And what do? We pick up very early stage enterprises, provide them funding, mentoring, and in order to actually make them successful. While doing that, I saw a need for capital and follow on capital, growth stage capital. And then I co founded a fund called Mentera.com for those who are interested to read more. So that is my day job today. While I stay on the board of Villgro, I actually am a partner at Mentera. And while Villgro started growing, we supported Villgro Africa, Villgro Philippines, and many others. And when we started realizing that incubators world over need to be convened, collaborating with each other, and that's how I was instrumental in backing and setting up Pollinate Impact. So I have a small leg there in helping set that network of global incubators and accelerators. So Villgro, Mentora, and Pollinate are the three things that I am actually part of.
Thank you very much, Paul. That's a really, really amazing background. We're going to come back to that later. For now, over to you, Wilfred. You have been on this show many times. You don't need any introduction, but there might be people joining us for the first time. So, for their sake, please give it a go also.
Thank you, Moses. Thank you for having me. It's amazing to be with Paul here, whom I consider a mentor. So, by background, I am a computer scientist by training. So I went to college. I did computer science, and back then, if you remember, there was the high hubs and all these tech hubs in Nairobi. Nairobi was known for these tech hubs after the success of Ushahidi. So being in computer science, I could see myself to taking a path in tech. So I went, worked in Middle East, came back. I had underestimated what it takes to start an idea. So while in Jordan, I was pitching a tech startup there. And I thought if I just win a $10,000 ticket, I will be done. I thought that that's all it will take to start an idea and grow. So when I came back to Kenya, I was reflecting on my journey and I realized that there was much more to do. I was still early in my career. So I applied for this fellowship to be with Villgro India, and that's how my journey connects with Villgro. And my motivation there was, how do you apply both capitalism and social impact? I mean, there are two diverse extremes. Social impact was predominantly NGO world. Tech was very purely looking more capitalistic, and there's this middle ground. And luckily, there was this term called impact investment that was being coined at that time when my path crossed with Paul's path. So I ended up now becoming spending a year with Villgro, coming here, and I'm now a co-founder, CEO at Villgro Africa, which has been 10 years journey. I also sit on investment committee of Jaza Rift Ventures and also Kazana Fund. Both of them are African-based funds. So that's a short summary of it, and happy to be here.
Thank you very much, Wilfred. So, to go deeper into our conversation for today, what we're doing is setting the scene for the season that really speaks to Villgro's origins. And part of what we're going to be doing with this particular conversation is discussing this whole idea of India as an example for Africa, South-South cooperation, in other words. And it's an important topic because I remember growing up, and even when I started in my career, you wouldn't hear a lot of examples from India, but Villgro is an excellent case study of successful South-South cooperation. So to start us off, we'll just pick up on the intro a bit, and starting with you, Paul. Why you, right? What is it about you as a person, in your opinion, that made you the right person to start Villgro? And tied to that, you said something interesting during your intro, which is that you just worked for 7 years and then started Villgro. What inspired you? Were there other incubators? You said this one was the first one. It sounds like pretty wild that you would take that direction. So if you could just go a bit into that.
Sure, happy to do that. As I mentioned to you, um, I don't think I was a born entrepreneur. That was not driving me. I think what was driving me was that I wanted to create impact. Now, is was that going to be through the entrepreneurship route, building something of my own? I wasn't really too bothered about that, but I knew that innovation. I knew that enterprise, innovation based enterprise, could create lasting impact on the lives of people. That's what I saw when I was working with Amul, the leading India's milk cooperative, that really transformed how India was producing milk. We were importers of milk for many years. But that whole ecosystem of Amul actually transformed the production of milk, where young women in rural areas were given loans to actually rear cows. And then a supply chain was created to procure that milk. And then, even better, value added products beyond liquid milk, butter, cheese, all of that were created. But then a whole ecosystem which actually involves artificial insemination of cows. That entire ecosystem was put together, and I saw the power of how, what Wilfred was alluding to earlier, the power of impact with a commercial enterprise could actually play together. While many other foreign chocolate companies, dairy companies, they struggle to actually enter India and scale, Amul became really scaled up and highly impactful. And that to me was the biggest inspiration where I had worked, which actually got me to say, hey, there are many more such innovations. Amul was a cooperative innovation, but there was tremendous potential for hardware innovation, for service innovations, business model innovations, and across multiple sectors, agribusinesses, healthcare, education, and so on and so forth. So, all of that really inspired me to take the step. But having said that, I should say that this idea of grassroots innovation, incubation, and all was, in a sense, being experimented very successfully in a city called Ahmedabad by a professor called Professor Anil Gupta, who was already working with grassroots innovators and actually supporting them in incubating. So I saw that model. I was very inspired by what they were doing, and that's how the origins of Villgro go back to 2001. So there were a couple of isolated models of grassroots innovation being supported, incubated, commercialized, but it hadn't really scaled up because India as a country hadn't started supporting startups in a big way. So I would say more than the skills that I had, I think it was the commitment to serve society, the commitment to create impact on the lives of people, leveraging innovation and enterprise that really led me to setting up Wilgo.
Thank you, Paul. I have never heard that part of the Villgro story before, and I think our audiences will also be happy to hear and quite excited to hear about Anil Gupta. I'll actually look him up as a source of inspiration, and to me, it speaks of how there are always examples in our contexts that we can learn from in terms of local innovation. So, to you, Wilfred, you did tell us that you had started out in the Middle East. Um, what pulled you to India, and what did you know of Villgro before you ended up in India? Was it just, happenstance, or was there, is there a backstory to how you ended up there?
Thank you, Moses. So after I came back from Middle East, I thought I was gonna go to Europe. I mean, I was part of an organization called ISEC, which was a student movement that would help recent graduates to do these international exchange programs. So you could go anywhere in the world, right? You point a finger, they would take you there, as long as your skills were able to match. So while I was applying many countries, an opportunity came from India, and it started to resonate with me that India and Africa are almost similar challenges. They are both in the developing economies segment, but India slightly ahead. Like you would see India as an elder brother in this space of developing countries. So it became a natural fit. And it was God leading me, because I hadn't met or read about Villgro. It was just as I was scanning through all these opportunities, I hear Villgro comes up. And the interview process itself was very aligned. Even speaking to them the first time, I was like, now this is something I want to do. Um, and what happened is I applied for two fellowships. One was Edge Talent Growth Business Assistance. It was called GBA, a fellowship program. And at the same time, I was in the Villgro Fellowship Program. So I was in a dual fellowship program. I think the only one in that batch that was in two fellowships at the same time. Both of them were serving the same goal. Both of these fellowships were immersion programs. Remember, the term impact investment had just been coined about 5 years prior, when Rockefeller Foundation in 2007 to thereabout came up with this term. So most of us in this fellowship were grappling with finding our feet. Most of us were early career to mid career professionals coming from banking, IT, different skills, different backgrounds, and were getting to learn about what is this impact investment. And at that time, Villgro India had this philosophy around immersion. So fellowship was one of the immersion. Immersion meant, as the impact investment is taking momentum, how do we immerse more people, more entrepreneurs to take on social entrepreneurship, more career professionals to take this journey? There are different players in that space to immerse more and more people into the impact investment space. So that's how I ended up with Villgro India. Did a 1 year fellowship. Um, Amazing experience. We had different people were coming from investment banking. We had people coming from pure tech, and we were all very excited. It was a very excited time because there was a lot of cross learning. Also, one of the fellowships, the Edge Talent, had people from different countries, from Italy, from Kenya, from West Africa, and it was very dynamic exchange experience. And we were all excited about what we were going to do after, right? So after I finished my term at Villgro, we were all thinking what next. And luckily, Paul was thinking of scaling Villgro at that time. So things aligned very well that I didn't have to come and set up something new. I was very, very fortunate that I could help continue with the Villgro story in Africa.
Thank you, Wilfred. So going back to you, Paul, and picking up on the early days of Villgro, what are some of the transformations that have taken place in India as a country? And within that backdrop, what kind of role would you say Villgro has played, particularly in the sectors where you operate?
Sure, sure. So just to give you a sense of numbers, um, around 2015-16, we had in India, there were around 500 odd recognized startups. That was what was the government of India recognized startups in 2015-16. We're talking about 500. Today, as of December 31st to 2024, we are 158,000 startups in India. So just think about this. From 500 startups, over less than 10 years, we've become 157,000 startups. Now, that can't happen overnight. It lot of concerted effort strategy that went in. And what does that mean? If I take another parameter, which means basically there's been a startup boom. But one contributor to that, one among two others that I will discuss, is has been incubators. In 2014-15, similar time period when there were 500 startups, there were less than 100 incubators in the country. India is a big country. So there were less than 100 incubators. Today, there are over 1,000 incubators and growing fast. More and more allocation from the government budgets going into incubators. Now, what does that mean? When more incubators happen, they incubate more companies. Many might fail, but some and many will succeed. So, incubators played a significant role behind the startup revolution in India without doubt, right? So that was the second data that I wanted to highlight. The third data that I wanted to highlight was venture capital was relatively new in the early days, which is I'm talking about 2013 to 15 periods. The Securities and Exchange Board of India had roughly 42 investment funds registered in India. Just 42 of them. Today, after 10 years, we have 1,200 odd startup investment funds, alternate investment funds registered by the Securities Exchange Board of India. Now, what does this mean? All this means that more incubators means more early stage startups, more venture funds mean more growth capital, which actually fuels some of these startups and answers, therefore, the big question, why have 500 startups in 2014 actually become 150,000 odd startups in as of December 2024. So, uh, in that journey, now I should also pick up another important metric. In in around the same period, 2015-16, we had very few governments who had embraced startup policies. Today, 31 out of the 36 states of India have a recognized, well formed startup policy, which means government budgets are going into support startups. Government budgets are going into supporting incubators. Government budgets are going into setting up entrepreneurship clubs in campuses and universities. So basically, more startups as a result of more incubators, more investment funds, and a much more supportive policy environment. And that is the big change that happened over the last, I would say, 10 years. And we at Villgro have been fortunate to be part of that wave where we are a government approved incubator, which is Villgro. At Mentera, we are one of the many venture capital funds now playing. And all of this capital, both the incubation capital as well as the investment capital, is actually going into sectors like agri healthcare, education, skills, livelihoods, and so on and so forth. And therefore, true impact investments, really, cutting loose is what I would think. But a big change in the dynamics, the energy, the vibrance of startups serving to create impact while making money and scaling.
That's an amazing story, Paul. I'm totally impressed. I did know that the startup ecosystem has been transformational in India, but this is mind-boggling. And just to dig a bit deeper, um, in terms of the sequence of events, and since we're trying to learn from India, uh, in terms of ecosystem building, where should the efforts start, in your opinion? Is it to increase the funnel as far as the startups are concerned, or the VCs? If you could just speak a bit to the cause and effect relationships that lead to this kind of phenomenal growth.
Yeah, I think it starts with entrepreneurs. Now, I think what is the difference? They were always businessmen. And what's the difference between business and entrepreneurship? If you wanted to run a fleet of taxis, there were always people running fleet of taxis. But building an Uber of aggregating demand is way different from running a fleet of taxis, right? Running a hotel is a business, but running a OYO, which is an aggregate of buying space from hotels which have enough spare rooms capacity and then selling it to customers, is another example of entrepreneurship, which is risk taking of a different kind. So business has always existed, but I think we're talking about first generation entrepreneurs taking risks with new products, new business models, new customer segments, and so on and so forth. So I think, in my view, creating them, encouraging them to take the risk, teaching entrepreneurship, which starts with campuses across. So in India, in all of these campuses, entrepreneurship clubs were created. There weren't too many successful role models to come and inspire them. But when you start offering risk funding, at Villgro, around, I'm talking about 2008, 2009 period, we worked with 4 or 5 universities across the country to create what we called My Idea programs, where young entrepreneurs were funded, small funding provided to actually build products and services which were impactful. We then followed up with creating a course that teaches innovation and social entrepreneurship. So I think it starts with entrepreneurs. When there are enough entrepreneurs, I think then investment funds will actually set up, because now they see a potential to invest and capitalize and make money. So I think good entrepreneurship culture needs governmental support to kick it off, but subsequently private capital then sets in. But I think it also starts with inspiring people to take to entrepreneurship with fully knowing that it's okay to fail, and that whole culture of failure. In fact, there was a movie that came called Three Idiots, which encouraged people to take unconventional careers. And I'm talking about somewhere around the same time that we're talking about, which allowed talent and youngsters to take to entrepreneurship or even work with some of these startup firms. Because in those days, people would wonder, hey, why are you working with not a multinational corporation as opposed to a startup? And then it became really cool to work with startups. So you need all of this. But I think the starting point of all of this is an entrepreneur. If you can encourage, inspire people to take to entrepreneurship, it's okay to fail, but you have a failed entrepreneur is far more knowledgeable than somebody who's not stepped or taken a step towards entrepreneurship.
I remember the movie Three Idiots from back in those days. I actually watched it. It was actually a comedy. It was a very nice movie and a very interesting title that they would call them idiots. But it just speaks to how there was concerted ecosystem effort to build the success you have in India now. And Wilfred, if you're to think back in the time when you were at Villgro India, and then what was going on in India at the time, what parallels can you draw between what was happening then there and what's going on here now that kind of speak to our trajectory, building on that story that Paul has just shared?
Thanks, Moses. I think a few things to contrast between Africa of today and India of 10 years ago, to compare and also contrast. First of all, when I was there are few building blocks that were being put in place. As Paul was talking about government backing, right? So it was in 2013 during my fellowship that the government introduced a new law that was looking at, it was a CSR Act of 2013 that mandated all companies, all for-profit companies to commit 2% of their profit towards CSR. And this CSR included poverty eradication, but also included R&D and incubation, supporting R&D, research, innovation, and incubation. So all of a sudden, new capital was unlocked. Local capital. We're talking local capital. Remember, in this space, we get a lot of money coming from outside, and you can see the impact of that in the times we're living in. That when this funding from outside ceases to exist, then you could have it would have a lot of ramifications and a lot of effects. So having local ownership is key, and I could see India taking that path of let's have, it's good we're getting funding from outside, but let's get also local, let's unlock local capital, and that's the job of the government. So that was one thing that was happening when I was there. The same time, the current Prime Minister Modi also took office when I was there, and he launched an initiative called Make in India. You know, this was an initiative to actually transform India into a manufacturing hub. So they had this backing and government backing and tariffs and incentives to actually make products in India, either local entrepreneurs building products in India or even multinationals coming and building in India, having products made locally, which then would remember India is a 1 billion people market. So that was now creating more and more opportunities for entrepreneurship, not just impact entrepreneurship, but entrepreneurship as a whole. The other thing that was happening there was the first generation entrepreneurs had this massive success story. You know, India back then there was a tech boom before at the turn of the millennium, where people like Infosys, people like Tata Consulting, there was a lot of these BPO business processing outfits that scaled and became huge campuses, employing hundreds of thousands of people. Now, looking at where we are now, comparing that with the Africa of today, you've seen that we have now, like last year, our President Ruto launched the Innovation Fund at the Kenya National Innovation Agency event, Kenya Innovation Week event last year, which is supposed to be a billion shillings fund, which then shows that government has a skin in the game when it comes to entrepreneurship. We are also seeing a lot of emerging of a lot of science parks, innovation parks in the country that make it possible, create a conducive environment for innovators to come and thrive. There's a lot still to be done, especially in unlocking local capital. I know there's a lot of movement towards unlocking even local pension funds that are sitting on billions of money. Actually, I hear that the Kenya pension funds sit on upwards of 30 billion, right? So there's a lot of local capital here, but it has to be unlocked. Most of it is going in real estate and traditional sectors. But how do we package healthcare, for example, where we invest in? How do you package that as an investable asset class for this local capital? So those are the things that I saw then. The other thing was, luckily, India is a single market, so one regulation allows you to access the entire market. Here in Africa, especially in healthcare, if you get your device or product approved in Uganda, you still have to repeat that again in Kenya. You still have to repeat that again in Rwanda. So it's not scalable. This model is not scalable because for every single market of 30, 40 million people, you have this number of regulatory hurdles. What I'm seeing now that would help us become a single market is the Africa Free Trade Area Agreement that was ratified a few years ago, that then would allow us to also start seeing. Remember, why do we have to scale? I mean, impact is not sustainable unless it can be scaled, right? If you're doing impact and you're only touching 100 people, then it's not sustainable. It's going to have to be donor dependent. But for it to be self-sustaining, it has to scale. And I think some of these acts that are bringing the market together are steps in the right direction. The innovation funds and all these other initiatives are some of the things that are in the right direction. There's still much more to learn from India and keep at it. Thank you.
You've talked about some of the building blocks being there, but I wonder, Wilfred, are there things that you saw in India in that context that lack here that might make it difficult for us to sort of replicate that success, or that demand for us to contextualize the Indian approach?
I don't think they are lacking. I think these are all things that can be, as Paul was mentioning, some of these initiatives can be replicated. And that's why it was possible to replicate Villgro, right? And you've seen over the last 10 years of Villgro Africa existence, how the ecosystem has evolved. Paul talked about India growing from 500 to over 100,000 innovators. We also, if we reflect, Kenya as an ecosystem, Africa as an ecosystem, we've also grown by leaps and bounds, right? From when we had a few incubators, less than 20 incubators back then, to over 100 incubators in the East Africa region, over 500 incubators as members of AfriLabs. So you can see the growth, the trajectory. Capital, look at capital funding raised. There's a report that is always shared on funding raised by startups. We started with below $1 billion about 5 years ago, not so long ago, up to in 2022 we hit a high of about $5 billion of VC funding in Africa. So we can see that growth, right? Look at market, and I like coming back to healthcare because that's where we are in. The medtech market 2 years ago in Africa was about $6 billion. Last year, when we were doing our conference, Transforming Africa MedTech Conference, it was about $9 billion. Next year, actually, end of this year, is projected to be $12 billion market, right? India, last year, when we were saying Africa was $7 billion, India was about $9 billion market. So you can see not big difference, right? Only that ours is fragmented, right? So India medtech market is only $2 billion larger than Africa. When we were at about 7 billion, they were at 9 billion. But then when you go there in the market in India, you see actually, you feel that you're dealing with an actual huge market. which you don't feel in Africa because we've broken that into very small markets that each of them has a certain regulatory hurdles. But all what I'm saying is it can be replicated. We've seen both are growing. I mean, both are growing economies. If you take a map and you look at the trajectory of India and Africa, the gradient would almost be the same, right? They are all growing at the same pace, only that one is further ahead. India is at least 5, 6, 7 years ahead of Africa. But my point is, yes, it can be replicated by bringing these stakeholders and actors together. Government has to do their job. Academic institutions have to do their job. Entrepreneurs have to do their part. Venture capitalists have to do their part. So everyone has to play their part to create this. There's no country that is born naturally entrepreneur. All these have been created. Even when you read about the startup nation, when you read about Israel as an innovation economy, you see the building. You can unearth the building blocks and see, okay, this is what they've done to put in place an enabling innovation ecosystem. So it can be done, is what I'm trying to say.
I really like your optimism, Wilfred. We can build it. And back to Paul. Had you been thinking about Africa before Wilfred showed up in India? And what led you, especially back then, to already start to think about expansion? And what was your vision? And if you look back then and then compare to what you're seeing at Villgro now, would you say that that vision has been realized? And what else do you see as a possibility?
You know, I looked at this simplistically, and of course, it was backed by some research, but we looked at it simplistically. And how did we look at it? One, we saw enough poor people, underserved people, disadvantaged people, just like we saw in India, we saw that in Africa. East Africa as a bloc was something like 6% of the global population. So it was clear that one could generate demand for innovations, for impactful enterprises, and so on and so forth. Be it all these sectors that we spoke about, healthcare, agribusinesses, and skilling, and things like that. So one was a sizable market. Of course, as Wilfred said, it was a little bit fragmented because each country was a little bit unique. But we saw a block in East Africa and therefore a sizable market. The second, we saw that a lot of donor agencies, philanthropic organizations were moving into Africa, in a sense, moving away from India because they saw that India was actually moving from being a very low income country to maybe a LMIC, a low and middle income country. So we saw that movement of philanthropic organizations. We saw many people saying, hey, we don't want to work in India, not because they didn't like India, just because they saw economic prosperity, financial prosperity slowly trickling in. I'd say not over the last 10 years, 20 years, but I think over the last 30, 30, 35 years. And they saw that people living at the base of the pyramid, incomes at the base of the pyramid were really increasing. So they said, maybe we're not relevant here as much as in Africa. So that was useful because more philanthropic funding, more early stage funding can actually help innovators, build products, services, seed companies, and so on and so forth. So that was the second trend that we saw. The third trend that we saw was more operational. We saw uh, English English speaking country in Kenya, and it was therefore easy for us to come and talk to entrepreneurs, talk to a person like Wilfred, talk to the ecosystem and get a sense of it. But West Africa was difficult. I didn't know French, so there was no way I could actually go and communicate and build trust and confidence. So English was super important, but we also liked, which didn't play out the way we thought. Kenya also has a big Indian population, whether it's Parklands and other places. So when I thought came in, I thought maybe there is a leverage of that possible, but it never got there. But the fact is that that Indian population was a driving thinking that we had. Maybe there was some uh, things that we could have done well, leveraging them better. But that was another thing that was riding on us. Finally, actually, two other things. A 6 hour flight from Mumbai made the costs of going to Africa much cheaper. It was not about taking, layover somewhere and then flying many, many hours. And, it was easy to do an overnight flight from Mumbai to Nairobi, and life would be easier. So that was a real factor because, interestingly, we wanted to do the left of India, which is Africa, and the right of India, which is Southeast Asia. In Southeast Asia, it was a struggle. We would never get a direct flight into any of the countries, but Nairobi was a little bit different, and that was also possibly because of the Indian community living in Nairobi and being connected with India. So this Mumbai Nairobi corridor was easy to travel to and operate. And lastly, we started seeing the emergence of impact investment activity. Sankalp was set up, I think, for the first time 2013 or 14, and we were able to interact, meet a lot of people through that forum, which made our life easier because it allowed us to, get a good sense of who are the players in the ecosystem and so on and so forth. So all these aspects, I think, made our job of coming into Africa easier. And obviously, there was Wilfred who knew that ecosystem, who already then by then had already studied the Indian ecosystem, and went back and got his co-founders and got things started. So I think on all these aspects, we were feeling very good that Kenya is a good place to actually be in. We also started seeing the birth of organization like the Kenya National Innovation Agency. I think it was sometime in 2013-14. I don't know where they've reached, but similar to the government push for innovation startups in India, I was betting on hoping that Kenya would be able to do that. I don't know whether they've done that, and I'm sure Wilfred might be able to comment on that. But a lot of that progress and movement on these aspects that I said made the decision for us to replicate in Kenya far more easier than any other country in the African continent.
Thank you, Paul. Wilfred, you go to India for your 1 year fellowship and you are charged with the huge responsibility of replicating in Villgro in Africa. What lessons did you come with that helped you to start to uh, put this vision together?
Thank you, Moses, for that question. As I said, this was an immersion experience. It was like a mini MBA squeezed into a few months. Um, One of the things I learned there that I really appreciate was the being able to see actually these market-based approaches in solving social problems and seeing that working. So there were enough examples when I arrived there in agriculture, in fintech, in healthcare, of actual companies. There was one I remember very well called Sustain Tech, which was looking at sustainable energy when it comes to cook stoves. So a better designed cook stove that could be sold to these restaurants across India, and seeing how that was transforming, saving cost, reducing emissions and things like that, and being able to do that in a sustainable manner, right? There was another one in fintech that was using local language to help clients access financial services, right? So there are a lot of examples that you could see happening, no longer theory, but actually viable businesses, and seeing how they were scaling. And some of the fellows I was in the same batch with were placed in these organizations. So it was a lot of excitement to see these things actually working. Um, the other thing that was dawning on me then was the power of charity, power of choices versus charity, right? While charity is good, is very disarming. But choice is empowering, right? So you could actually, instead of giving someone a handout, create a model where they can actually pay affordably for a service, be it education, be it healthcare, and they are able to walk with their head high, that they are able to afford it, right? And that really was very it was a wake up, a turning moment for me to see that power of empowerment through choices, right? The other thing I liked and I learned when I was there was that even if you're serving the bottom of the pyramid, they like nice things in life, right? So they care about how you design it. If you say, for example, these eyeglasses are gonna be affordable, and then you make it anyhowly, and then you think the person will buy because they're in the bottom of the pyramid, then you'll be shocked. I learned hands on that they care about the aesthetic appeal, they care about how it looks, how it feels, even though you're making it affordably. So they like being treated with dignity and empathy. And I could see how Villgro India portfolio was applying things like human-centered design, for example, to create these products that are appealing they are appealing, and they create a delightful customer experience for the bottom of the pyramid. The other thing that we were able to do when I was there, Paul encouraged us to do these rural visits. So one night we spent in a rural farm with farmers, sleep out in the farm with the village folks, and I experienced their life, be in their shoes. So that created empathy, and when we came back, that became one of the things we were doing at Villgro Africa. Pre-COVID, we were doing a lot of these site visits, get on a bus or get on a flight, go to Uganda, go to this village, be there, visit this rural hospital, immerse yourself in their reality so that as you're building the product, it will be able to solve their needs. The other thing that I learned, which was very useful, especially from Paul, was the right of asking the right questions, right? You might have noticed already that when you engage with Paul, there's always a methodical way of asking questions and going deeper, not at the surface, but going much deeper and probing. So because the quality of questions you ask determines the quality of insights you get, right? And that became a very useful skill when we were setting Villgro Africa, as we were assessing these businesses. How do we ask the customer the right questions? How do you ask the founder the right questions? And then with all that, and that is more like know-how. So I came with that know-how, but then I was also empowered now with knowledge and tools and products. We had an entire due diligence checklist that I came back with. We had an entire manual on how to run an incubator. Paul had launched this incubator playbook that actually was free to download by anybody in the world. So in addition to the know-how, there was a knowledge, there was a tools, there was a template, and also a lot of hand-holding. The first few years, Paul used to come to Kenya every 4 months. He was here every 4 months, and there was a lot of hand-holding in doing those due diligence, in structuring deals. So that it was not an overnight experience. Even after I came back, there was a continuous hand-holding. We even had exchange programs between Villgro India and Villgro Africa, where some colleagues from Villgro India spent substantial time here. We had Mariela spending 1 year plus. We had Paul Belknap spending another 2 years. And that's how now the full transfer became complete with this hand-holding. But the most important thing was also the brand, that when we were introducing ourselves, Villgro was already known as a brand. That helped open conversations with much ease with our funders like Lemelson Foundation, USAID, and others. So these are some of the things that I came back with after the 1 year experience.
Thank you very much, Wilfred. I really like that, particularly this idea of empowerment, dignity, and empathy as being part and parcel of product development for people at the bottom of the pyramid. And my big takeaway from what you just said is that you left India with a new mindset, a skill set, and a tool set. And that's really amazing that Paul and Villgro India set you up to succeed as you built Villgro Africa. So now we've been speaking about the past. As we draw to the end of this conversation, I would like you both to just quickly paint a vision of the future. Starting with you, Paul, you are not an African, all right, but when you think back to what you saw then and what you see now, could you speak a bit to what you think are the possibilities? And as you do that, are there any um, lessons, particularly pitfalls, that you think we should avoid along the way that come about as part of your learning in the Villgro India journey?
Sure. Both Africa and India, we share several similarities. We have a shared history of European colonialism. We have diverse cultures. We have large populations. And therefore, a big opportunity to learn from each other. Um, with that context, I'd say one big difference between India and Africa, I think, is what Wilfred alluded to earlier, is you have so many different smaller countries with different regulations in Africa. But in India, we do have a lot of smaller states, but a federal system. But today, with the Goods and Services Tax, with the Indian Companies Act, with Aadhaar, which is a common ID, unique ID for every citizen of the country, we've unified the diversity in that country, in a large country like India. So I would think it becomes important for free trade, what Wilfred was alluded to. There is an agreement between countries in Africa, but I think you need to take it a step up, which is something like a global, goods and services tax, which is equally applicable in all countries and so on and so forth. So I think that's one. How do you ensure regulations in multiple countries are similar? Because that allows cross-border movement to happen and trade to happen and business to flourish. So that was one. I think the second is in the nature of the market opportunity. India has done big push in the solar renewable energy space. We did a big push early 1960s in green revolution where we improved our agricultural productivity. I am not too sure whether we should do a chemical fertilizer push in agricultural revolution and therefore a green revolution. But I think there is a need to improve agricultural productivity and African farmers being introduced into global value chains. It's happening, but I'm saying there is tremendous opportunity in creating traceability, in creating processed foods and products. Because being a tropical country, I think that's very similar to where India is, and I think one can learn a lot. So a renewable energy push, but a much more managed green revolution, I think, can go a long way with respect to agriculture in Africa. I am I'm a little bit worried about the import of a lot of medical devices that happen into Africa now. But can we create local indigenous innovation for many of the medical devices and products? Now, one challenge for that is the scientific temper. I think at the scale at which India is not there in Africa. We produce, the latest numbers say we've produced 14 lakh, which is 1.4 million engineers on an annual basis. While I understand that in Africa is is relatively low, and one of the UNESCO reports have published a report, I think way back in 2021, saying that Africa continues to have the lowest number of engineering professionals per capita when compared to all regions of the world. So I think that engineering mindset, which allows a lot of that engineering innovation to happen, technology building to happen, I think there is a way to build that as opposed to depending on uh, external innovation, which is, I think, why a lot of that import happens now. So how do you allow import to happen, but how do you actually get local innovation to learn from that and indigenize, which is what India did with what is called Atmanirbhar, which is make in India, self-reliance and things like that. So if some of that policy push can happen, I think that will also be great. But as I mentioned in the start, this big push for entrepreneurship, startup policies, I think is something that the East African bloc can do a lot. And therefore, more incubators, more capital, more entrepreneurs, more support systems for them, I think can go a long way in encouraging innovation, startups, and finally creating impact on the lives of people who are underserved.
Thank you, Paul. I really, really resonate with what you're saying, and particularly the philosophical underpinning uh, that kind of drives all of the action. That make in India is a really good uh, lesson. Over to you, Wilfred, for a look into the future.
Thank you. Building on what Paul has shared, that as I said earlier, policy really. I think that's the we find that in Africa, entrepreneurs, investors are doing most of the job, but policy is having to play catch up. Um, we are lucky that a startup bill was introduced in Kenya. Was it last year or last year but one? We need to see more of this, but then also harmonize across Africa so that you don't go to Uganda, then you have a new startup policy. You go to because our startups we've learned that cannot be a single market startup. Any startup that will raise investment has to go beyond the borders of the country they're operating in. That's why even Villgro Kenya had to become Villgro Africa, right? To broaden the scope. So if then we're serving Africa, then we should look at how do we harmonize these policies so that our policy compares with the Ethiopia startup policy, with the Uganda. And there's a lot of hope. When I led the Ethiopia startup policy, it actually has what we call a startup leave that a researcher, a professor can take 2 years of paid leave to actually go and invent, right? And these are the incentives that then these engineers, these scientists can leverage. That it makes it easier to take that leap, that risky path that Paul said is, entrepreneurship is risky. But if you have a fallback plan with this startup leave, then more and more people will take the immersion. Um, Back to engineering, Paul talked about the numbers of engineers, and you can see the growth. I mean, I was there 10 years ago, it was about 500,000 engineers a year. Now, India is churning 1.4 million, is it? Yeah. So we need to also step up. And the challenge here has been, where do those engineers go? Even the few ones we are training, you'll be surprised, Paul, that they end up in the banking as tellers or taxi drivers. There's no market to absorb them, and hence maybe why the numbers are dwindling. So going back to incentives and infrastructure and policy, how do we come up with a policy that says, even if you're going to import, we want to see X% local content? That means send some knockdown kits, let them be assembled here. Don't send us finished products. We can start by doing assembly as we continue building our own market. I think Maruti is a very good example where it was a Japanese merger with a local Indian entity to actually come up with a vehicle that is made in India for India, even though it's a Japanese, it's a Suzuki. So how do we get that same mindset in medtech? How do we get a Philips device that has local context? Because we also have different contexts, right? The power fluctuation, even genetically, and how there's nuances to there are some nuances, right? So that you don't just ship in something that has worked in Europe and you push it down to the African market. We would like to see more customization, more local context with local input, even as we start building our own fully fledged local medtech devices. I think that's the future. But then to paint even a brighter picture, as I said, last year our medtech market was about $8 billion in Africa. In India, it was about 10 billion. If you combine these two, then you have $18 billion medtech. And by medtech, I mean devices. We are not counting digital health. It's easily going to be a $20 market. So how do we even boost trade between India and Africa? I was just looking now, and India-Africa trade is only 7%, right? Total GDP of India is like $3.7 trillion. Africa is $3.2 trillion. Again, these are numbers that I just checked, so don't quote me on that. But combine these two, then that becomes substantial, right? You end up with a 7 trillion, almost $10 trillion market. Then that is able to absorb the shocks like what we experienced during COVID. Also, when the war broke in Ukraine, there was a lot of shock because we're doing a lot of trade with Europe. It's more like north-south trade, and even now we're in those similar challenges. When a government or a regime changes in one part of the world, it affects us here. So how do we boost more trade between ourselves to increase that resilience? We've already seen impact funds that are investing in both India and Africa. So we should follow that example. We have people like Beyond Capital investing both here and in India. We have Intellicap, many others. So we can start bringing, even as we aggregate Africa market, also boost India-Africa market. As Paul was saying, there's already a trade corridor there and a long history, same language, similar culture. So there's a lot we can do together. And in MedTech, we are beginning that with our MedTech lead, Winnie. We're already talking to MedTech incubators in India, like IKP, Eden, and others, to say, what can you help us do? We are able to prototype, we're able to do very good designs, but can you help us to get into that fast pilot manufacturing? These are things we are beginning to actualize in our MedTech department, so that we start really doing more together and aggregating these markets. Then we can become now a powerhouse to reckon with. Imagine a proper Africa-India trading bloc that is formalized, as policy backing it. There's incentives, there's tariff incentives, there's import duty incentives. Then that would be amazing for everyone in the global south if we went that direction. So I think future is bright. Good thing our markets are growing. If you look at the markets in the north hemisphere and in the western hemisphere, their markets are growing maybe at 2%, at best 3%, right? While here we are growing minimum 5% year on year, 6-7% year on year. So we are in the as they say, we are the frontier market, and this is the market that needs to be tapped. It creates a lot of opportunities for job creation, for impact, for poverty eradication, and things like that. So I think where I sit, the future is very bright.
Thank you very much, Wilfred and Paul. We have come to the end of this conversation, and I will not end before I say that I celebrate you both. I celebrate you, Paul, for your risk-taking. You actually embody the entrepreneurial spirit. You've walked the walk for more than 20 years and have literally moved from idea to impact. These are the very things that we encourage entrepreneurs to do, and you've done it. And Wilfred, Villgro Africa would not exist without you. It wouldn't exist without your ambition, entrepreneurial drive, and ability to learn and execute. So thank you very much, gentlemen, but don't get tired. There's a long road ahead. We look forward to the next 10 years of Villgro. Thank you.